the letter that shattered the silence. The wind howled down Clark Street the day Margaret Sinclair died, rattling the warped windows of my bookstore like a warning from the grave. It was late November in Chicago, the kind of cold that seeps through your coat, past your skin, and into your bones, settling there like an unwelcome guest. I was 23, hunched over a stack of yellowed paperbacks, the smell of old ink and dust thick in the air, when the mail carrier dropped off an envelope, ivory paper, heavy as a brick, sealed with crimson wax like something out of a Bronte novel. My name was scrawled across it in her jagged, deliberate handwriting. Inside, I found her final words and a pile of documents that hit me like a runaway L train. Controlling shares in Sinclair Holdings, a real estate empire sprawling from New York to Tokyo to London, and $50 million in investments so meticulously diversified they could weather a decade of market storms. But it wasn't the wealth that stopped my breath. It was her opening line, penned in black ink that seemed to bleed into the page. People show their truest selves only when they think you have nothing. Those words sank into me, sharp and heavy, louder than the sleet pelting the glass outside. I sat frozen at the counter, the letter trembling in my hands, my mind replaying every snide remark, every dismissive glance from my family over the years. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the empty store, and my phone buzzed on the wooden surface beside me. Victoria Clark, my mother, her name flashing like a neon warning sign. I let it ring out. I didn't need to pick up to hear her voice slicing through the air, crisp and cold as the wind off Lake Michigan. Did that grandmother of yours leave us anything worth a damn, or just more of her useless books? I didn't call her back. Instead, I grabbed my coat, a thrift store find, frayed at the cuffs, and drove through the slush-choked streets to my parents' house, a pristine Lincoln Park mansion they'd leveraged to the hilt to keep pace with the Langfords and the Whitmores. The kind of place where love was a rumor whispered in the hallways, where image reigned supreme, polished to a high gloss and hung on the walls like a gallery of lies. Victoria was in the dining room when I walked in, her blonde hair swept up into a perfect chignon, sipping a martini she'd charged to a credit card that was already screaming for mercy. The room smelled faintly of lavender and gin, a brittle elegance clinging to every surface. "Well?" she asked, arching a brow so meticulously sculpted it must have cost a small fortune at some Gold Coast salon. "What did that old bat leave you? Anything useful, or just another pile of her precious novels?" "Just books," I lied, folding the letter into my jacket pocket, the weight of it pressing against my chest like a hidden blade. "Some old photographs, too. Nothing you'd care about." She snorted, a sound that carried all the contempt she'd perfected over decades. Figures. Margaret never understood real value. No wonder she holed up in that drafty Gold Coast townhouse, scribbling in her journals instead of joining the right circles. The right circles. The Langfords, whose steel empire was crumbling faster than a rusted bridge over the Chicago River. The Whitmores, dodging tax liens like it was an Olympic sport. The Kensingtons, who'd traded their dignity for a yacht they couldn't even navigate out of Lake Michigan. I could have told her right then that I owned their mortgage, their credit lines, their entire fragile existence, but I swallowed the truth like a bitter pill. "Not yet." "You know what people would say if they saw that rust-bucket Honda of yours parked in our driveway?" she continued, her voice dripping with disdain as she swirled the olive in her glass. "I'm sure they've got bigger problems," I muttered, my eyes drifting to the chandelier overhead, a gaudy monstrosity they'd refinanced the house to buy, its crystals catching the light like tears frozen in mid-fall. Her eyes narrowed to slits, a predator sizing up prey. That's exactly the kind of attitude I'd expect from her granddaughter. No sense of how the world actually works. I forced a smile, sharp and cold as the sleet streaking the windows. Thank God Nathan's got it all figured out, right? Harvard Business School, and everything. Her face lit up instantly, like I'd flipped a switch from contempt to pride. "Exactly. He's just been accepted. We're throwing a celebration tonight. Everyone who matters will be there. Wear something appropriate, Isabella. The blue dress I picked out for you. Don't embarrass us in front of the guests." She didn't ask how I was holding up after Margaret's death. Didn't notice the storm brewing in my chest, the way my fingers curled into fists beneath the table. Didn't see that the daughter she'd dismissed for years was now the one holding the keys to her gilded cage. One day, Victoria Clark would drown in the shallow pool of her own vanity. And I'd be the one standing on the shore, handing her the mirror to watch herself sink. The masquerade of desperation. Back at my apartment, a cramped walk-up above the bookstore that smelled of mildew and coffee, I stood in front of my closet, staring at the blue cocktail dress Victoria had insisted on. It hung there like a costume from a play I'd never auditioned for, its loud designer label screaming money and tastelessness, the kind of thing she thought shouted class but only whispered desperation. I tossed it onto the bed and pulled out a simple black sheath instead. Clean lines, understated elegance, the kind of quiet power Margaret would have nodded at approvingly. Power didn't need to scream to be felt. It just needed to exist, steady and unshakable. The party was at the mansion, a glittering shrine to debt masquerading as wealth. The heat barely worked. Chicago winters don't care about your overdrawn accounts, but the foyer was buried in floral arrangements that must have cost more than my monthly rent, their perfume clashing with a faint tang of desperation in the air. I handed the keys to my beat-up Honda Civic to the valet. Yes, they'd hired a valet because appearances trumped reality every time, and stepped inside, the chandelier's light refracting off crystal flutes and polished smiles. The room buzzed with the chatter of Chicago's elite, their voices layered with gossip and the clink of glasses, a symphony of pretense I'd learned to tune out years ago. Victoria greeted me at the door, her smile so tight it could have snapped like a brittle twig. "I told you to ditto wear the blue dress," she said, her voice sharp as the wind cutting through the loop. "You're going to embarrass us looking like that." "This one was clean," I said smoothly, brushing past her into the crowd, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor, a sound swallowed by the hum of laughter and clinking ice. She grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin like tiny talons. "At least make an effort with Christopher Langford tonight," she hissed, her breath tinged with gin. "His family's company is thriving. It could be a good connection for you if you'd stop being so stubborn." I smiled thinly, a practiced mask. If only she knew. The Langfords were 90 days from bankruptcy, their stock hemorrhaging value faster than a Cubs losing streak in September. I'd quietly bought up a chunk of their debt through a shell company last quarter, a move so discreet even their overpaid accountants hadn't caught it yet. But I nodded, playing along. "Sure, Mother. I'll chat with Christopher." Then came the grand entrance. Nathan strolled in, his tuxedo gleaming under the lights, his grin wide and cocksure, basking in the spotlight like he'd invented it. Our father, Edward, clapped him on the back with a proud, booming laugh that echoed off the high ceilings. "There's my boy, Harvard Business School's newest star." The guests swarmed him like bees to honey, their faces alight with admiration, conveniently forgetting the 3 startups he'd torched through over the past 5 years, each one a money pit my parents had dutifully filled with hundreds of thousands of dollars from their dwindling reserves. Failure never stuck to Nathan, not when Victoria and Edward were there to wipe it away, polishing his image like it was a priceless antique. I stood off to the side, sipping water from a crystal glass, watching the performance unfold with a mix of disgust and detachment. Christopher Langford appeared beside me, a champagne flute dangling from his fingers, his smug rich boy smirk perfectly rehearsed, probably since he was 12, posing for family photos in their Lake Forest estate. "Still slumming it at that little bookstore, Isabella?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Someone's got to pay the bills," I replied, my voice even, my eyes fixed on the crowd rather than his practiced charm. He laughed, oblivious as ever. "If you ever want a real job, I could talk to my father. We're always looking for motivated people, someone with a bit of grit." "I'll keep that in mind," I said sweetly, picturing his father's signature on the default notice I'd authorized last week, tucked away in a file on my desk 47 floors above the city. The rest of the evening blurred into a haze of champagne toasts and social climbing, the guests orbiting Nathan like he was the sun in their little universe. I drifted through it like a ghost, invisible unless they needed a punchline. Oh, you know Nathan's older sister, Isabella. She works in a bookstore. Their laughter stung, but I let it slide off me, my gaze catching the cracks they couldn't see, the tension in Edward's jaw as he signed a catering bill with a pen that trembled slightly, the way Victoria flinched when someone asked about their summer trip to the Caymans. I knew the truth. It wasn't a vacation but a frantic meeting with offshore creditors, a last-ditch effort to keep the wolves at bay. They were unraveling, thread by fragile thread. And I stood there, silent, holding the end of the rope they didn't even know existed. The Tower of Secrets. I didn't go back to the apartment above the bookstore that night. That place was a shell, a carefully crafted lie I'd lived for years. Cramped, drafty, with a mattress that sagged in the middle and a coffee pot that hissed more than it brewed. My real home was the 47th floor of Sinclair Tower, a glass-walled fortress perched above Chicago's restless skyline, the city stretching out below like a map I'd memorized in the dark. My name wasn't on the building, not yet. Margaret had taught me better than that. Real power doesn't need a neon sign. It thrives in the shadows, whispering louder than any shout. The bookstore itself was a front, a quaint little stage play I'd perfected. I owned the entire block it sat on. 2 trendy cafes pulling in 6 figures a year with their overpriced lattes and artisanal scones, a law firm on the 3rd floor churning out billable hours, and a luxury loft on the top level, currently leased to a state senator's mistress who paid in cash and kept her blinds drawn. But to my family, I was still Isabella the failure, the older sister with ink-stained fingers and scuffed shoes, driving a Honda Civic that coughed its way through the streets. Let them believe it a little longer. My assistant, Emily, buzzed in just as I settled behind my glass desk, the leather chair creaking under me like it was testing my weight. She was young, sharp, a college dropout I'd plucked from a dead-end barista gig 3 years ago, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun that somehow still looked professional. "Miss Clark," she said through the intercom, her voice clipped and efficient, "another $175,000 just left your parents' emergency fund." Nathan's signature. I leaned forward, the city lights glinting off the desk surface. "Where'd it go?" "Luxury auto dealer on Michigan Avenue," she replied. "Same one that handled the Porsche last year. A new Maserati, from what I can tell, black, custom rims." I pulled up their account on my laptop, the numbers glowing starkly against the screen. Less than $40,000 remained, a pitiful puddle in a once-deep well. The next mortgage payment, $62,000, was due in 5 days, and their credit lines were tapped out, their refi applications denied by every bank from here to the Loop. "Schedule the foreclosure notices," I said, my voice calm as the lake on a rare windless morning, though my pulse ticked up a notch. "Start with the mansion. Routed through Clark Properties, LLC. Keep it clean." "Yes, ma'am," Emily said, then hesitated, her tone shifting. "There's something else." A transfer request came through, an attempt to siphon $200,000 from Sinclair Holdings' discretionary fund. It was flagged and stopped by our security protocols, but the IP traces back to our building. My stomach twisted, a cold knot forming. "Who?" "I'm still digging," she said. "Could be a glitch or someone with access. I'll have an answer by morning." "Find out," I said, my voice hardening to steel. "I don't care if you have to tear apart every terminal in this tower. I want a name." Betrayal wasn't new to me. I'd grown up with it, felt it in every backhanded compliment from Victoria, but from inside my own ranks. That was a fresh wound, raw and unexpected. For the past year, I'd been buying up their debt. Every mortgage, every credit card, every reckless refinance deal they'd signed to maintain their facade of wealth. I'd done it through shell corporations, Clark Properties, Sinclair Capital, Horizon 8, layering my moves so carefully that even their overpaid financial advisor hadn't caught the pattern. They thought the banks still held their leash. They were dead wrong. Victoria once told me, years ago over a tense Thanksgiving dinner, that image was everything. "Success is perception, Isabella, not substance," she'd said, her fork poised over a turkey she'd barely touched, her eyes flicking to Nathan's latest Rolex. She'd built her entire life on that mantra, dragging Edward and Nathan into her glittering illusion, a house of cards balanced on borrowed time and borrowed money. But perception doesn't pay the electric bill when ComEd cuts the power. Illusions don't stop a sheriff's deputy from taping an eviction notice to your front door. I stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the city's restless glow. The Chicago River snaked through the skyline, its surface catching the lights like fractured stars. Somewhere down there, Nathan was probably flooring his new Maserati down Lakeshore Drive, the engine roaring as he chased the high of entitlement. My parents were likely in the dining room, toasting their success, with a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet they couldn't afford, oblivious to the axe I'd sharpened for them. And now, someone in my own tower was reaching for my throat, their fingers brushing the edges of my empire. I didn't want to destroy my family, not entirely. Not at first. But they'd handed me the match, struck it themselves with every slight, every dollar they'd poured into Nathan while I scraped by. And now someone else, it seemed, was fanning the flames. The fall begins. The next morning, I was at the bookstore, perched on a stool behind the counter, pretending to balance the ledger, a leather-bound prop I kept for appearances. The shop was quiet, save for the hum of the ancient radiator and the occasional drip of melting snow from the awning outside. The numbers in front of me blurred as I traced them with a pencil, my mind elsewhere, when the front door burst open with the force of a Lake Michigan gale. Victoria stormed in, last season's Chanel coat clinging to her like a life raft, her blonde hair slightly askew from the wind. In her trembling hand, she waved a crumpled foreclosure notice, like it was a declaration of war, the official seal glaring red against the white paper. "Isabella," she shrieked, her voice shrill and cracking, cutting through the stillness like a siren. "This is a catastrophe. An absolute disaster." I looked up slowly, deliberately, setting the pencil down with a soft tap. "Good morning, Mother," I said, my tone even, my face a mask of calm. "Don't you dare play dumb with me," she snapped, slamming the notice onto the counter. So hard the bell above the door gave a belated jingle. "Clark Properties, whoever the hell they are, they're threatening to take the house. Our home." I tilted my head, feigning surprise. "That's unexpected," I said, folding my hands atop the ledger, the leather cool against my skin. "No, it's impossible," she retorted, her voice breaking like thin ice underfoot. "Your father just needs a little more time. He's working on a deal with some investors in Dallas. This can't happen." "It won't happen." She lunged across the counter and grabbed my wrist, her nails, perfectly painted but chipped at the edges, digging into my skin like desperate claws. "Darling," she said, her tone softening to a plea, her eyes wide and glistening. "Do you have anything saved? Even a little emergency fund? Anything at all? We'll pay you back, I swear it." I almost laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that caught in my throat. The same woman who'd spent 2 decades mocking my pathetic little bookstore job, who'd once told me I'd never amount to more than a librarian with bad fashion sense, was now begging for crumbs from the daughter she'd dismissed. "I can make 35 grand a year, remember?" I said, my voice cutting like a blade, honed by years of her disdain. "After rent and bills, I've got maybe 3,000 saved. That's it." "That's fine," she exclaimed, her grip tightening, her desperation palpable. "We'll take it just until things stabilize. Nathan has something in the works. He just bought that new Maserati. You've seen it, haven't you? Investors will take him seriously now. He needs to project success." I stared at her, the heat rising in my chest like steam off the lake in winter. "You mean he needs to look successful?" I said, each word deliberate, "while I'm still the failure. Unlike me." She blinked once, twice, flustered, her composure slipping like a mask unhooked. "You're different, Isabella," she said quickly, waving a hand as if brushing away a fly. "You're not in those circles. You wouldn't understand." My jaw clenched, the heat turning to fire. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous, a growl beneath the calm. Her eyes widened. "Excuse me?" I stepped around the counter, close enough to smell the gin on her breath masked by expensive perfume, now sour with panic. I said, "Get out of my store." I repeated, each syllable a hammer strike. "And don't ever ask me for money again." She stood there, frozen, a queen dethroned, her crown cracked, mascara streaking down her cheeks like black rivers. Then she turned on her heel, her boots slamming the hardwood, and stormed out, slamming the door so hard the bell clanged like a gunshot, reverberating through the empty shop. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the silence settling back in like dust after a storm. My hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what I'd just done, what I was about to do. That evening, the phone rang in my penthouse, the sound cutting through the hum of the city beyond the glass. I picked it up, knowing who it was before I heard his voice. "Isabella," Edward began, his tone stern and paternal, the voice he used when he thought he could still command me. "We need to discuss this situation like adults. Your mother tells me you were unhelpful today." "I can't give you my savings, Dad," I said, leaning against the window, the cold glass pressing against my shoulder as I stared at the skyline's jagged glow. "Listen here, young lady," he snapped, his voice rising. "This family has a reputation to uphold. If we lose the house, do you have any idea what that'll do to Nathan's prospects? That car was an investment in his future, something you wouldn't grasp." "And what about my future?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm, the question hanging between us like smoke. A long pause stretched out, the silence thick with years of neglect. "Let's be realistic," he said finally, his tone softening into something almost pitying. "You work in a bookstore. Your future's already set." I let that sink in, the words landing like stones in a still pond. "Then I guess you're no daughter of mine," he finished, his voice clipped final. The line went dead with a soft click, leaving me alone with the hum of the city and the weight of his dismissal. I stood there in my $1,000 heels, the leather creaking faintly, and smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of my lips. They still didn't know who I was, what I held. But someone did, and they were closer than I'd ever imagined. The betrayal unveiled. It was midnight when Emily called, her voice tight and urgent through the penthouse's sleek phone system. "I found it," she said, breathless. "The transfer request, it came from my desk. But I didn't send it, Isabella. I swear." I paced the hardwood floor, my bare feet silent against the polished grain, the skyline a restless blur beyond the glass. "Who did?" I asked, my pulse ticking up, a drumbeat in my ears.
"It's complicated," she said.
"Someone used my login, rerouted through a VPN to mask the source. But there's more." I dug into Nathan's accounts. He's been emailing someone here. Code name Shadow. They've been feeding him intel about you. My blood turned to ice, a chill that spread from my chest to my fingertips. "What kind of intel?" "Not the full picture," she said, her words rushed but precise. "Just enough to keep him in the game. Your debt purchases, vague hints about a big move. Shadow told him you're planning something massive, but didn't know what." "Find Shadow," I said, my voice cutting through the night like a blade.
"Now."
"I'm trying," she said, a tremor in her tone. "But Isabella, there's a chance it's someone you trust. Someone close." I hung up, my mind racing like the L train hurtling through the tunnels below. Nathan wasn't clever enough to orchestrate this alone. He could barely balance his own checkbook without Edward's help. Someone inside Sinclair Holdings was playing both sides, someone who knew my moves but not my endgame. Emily? No, she'd been with me since the beginning, a scrappy kid I'd pulled from a coffee shop 3 years ago, her loyalty proven in 100 late nights and 1,000 small victories. But if not her, then who? I sank into my chair, the leather cool against my back, and stared at Margaret's letter on the desk, its edges worn from my touch. The city hummed outside, a restless beast, and I wondered how deep the rot went. The next morning, Emily burst into my office, her face flushed, her laptop clutched under her arm. "It's Carter," she said, breathless. "The IT guy. He's Shadow." Carter. Quiet, mousy Carter, with his wire-rimmed glasses and nervous laugh, the one who'd fixed my laptop a dozen times, always lingering a beat too long. "Proof?" I asked, leaning forward, my hands flat on the glass. "Chat logs on his personal drive," she said, setting the laptop down and opening a file. "He's been feeding Nathan scraps for months. Thought he could cash in when Nathan turned the tables. The transfer attempt was his move to cover his tracks. Pin it on me." I scanned the screen, timestamps, coded messages, Nathan's frantic replies. "She's got something on us. Huge. Dig deeper." My stomach churned. Carter had sat across from me in meetings, nodding along, all while slipping knives into my back. "Where is he now?" I asked, my voice low, controlled. "Downstairs," she said. "I locked his system. He doesn't know we're onto him yet." "Call security," I said, standing, my shadow stretching across the desk. "Then pull Nathan's latest email. I want everything." She nodded, disappearing. 5 minutes later, she returned with a printout, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. "Nathan to Shadow, sent at 2:14 a.m. She's got something massive on us. Push harder. I need leverage before it's too late." The twist hit me like a punch to the gut. Nathan wasn't just a spoiled brat coasting on privilege. He'd been hunting me, guided by a traitor in my own tower. Carter hadn't just betrayed me. He'd underestimated me, thinking he could outmaneuver the empire I'd built brick by silent brick. "Bring Carter up here," I said, my voice steady despite the fire in my chest. "And prep the courtroom filing. Tomorrow's going to be a reckoning they'll never forget." The reckoning. The night before the courtroom showdown, I sat alone in my office, the city sprawling below like a restless sea of light and shadow. The air was thick with the hum of the tower's ventilation, a low drone that matched the pulse in my temples. Margaret's letter lay open on the desk, its edges curling from years of handling, her words staring back at me like a challenge. "People show their truest selves only when they think you have nothing." I traced her handwriting with a fingertip, the ink faded but indelible, and a knot tightened in my chest. What would she think of me now? Ruthless? Calculating? A predator in a world of prey? Or just surviving, the way she had, clawing her way up from nothing while men in suits laughed behind her back? I leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking, and closed my eyes, the weight of tomorrow pressing down like the steel girders of the Willis Tower. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in, a whisper in the dark. Was this who I wanted to be? The daughter who burned her family's castle to ash, not out of justice but spite? My hand hovered over the phone, trembling slightly. Maybe I could call it off, wire them the $3,000 they'd begged for, give them one last lifeline. Let them stumble on without ever knowing the truth. But then I saw her face in my mind, Margaret at 60, sitting with me on a bench outside the bookstore, her gray hair pulled back, her eyes fierce as she handed me a cup of cocoa and said, "Don't ever let them make you small, Isabella. They'll try. They always do." She'd built Sinclair Holdings from a single typewriter and a rented office above a butcher shop, faced worse wolves than Victoria or Nathan could ever dream of being, and she'd left it all to me, not to coddle, but to finish. I folded the letter, the paper crinkling softly, and stood, smoothing my Chanel suit with steady hands. Doubt was a luxury I couldn't afford, not now, not when the stage was set and the curtain about to rise. I'd built this moment, brick by bloody brick, and I wouldn't flinch from it. The courtroom smelled of polished oak and quiet panic, a perfect Chicago backdrop for a fall from grace. I slipped into the back row unnoticed, my charcoal suit hugging me like armor, my heels silent on the worn carpet. The room was filling fast. Chicago's elite never missed a public execution, their whispers buzzing like flies over a corpse. At precisely 9 a.m., Judge Evelyn Morgan took the bench, her glasses glinting under the fluorescent lights. "Case number 3481, she announced, her voice crisp and authoritative. "The matter of Clark family bankruptcy." My parents sat at the front, their heads high, but their postures brittle, like porcelain stretched too thin, ready to shatter with a single tap. Nathan slouched beside them, scrolling through his phone, his tie slightly askew, still pretending the world spun for him alone. "The court acknowledges the presence of the creditor's representative?" Morgan asked, peering over her glasses. I rose slowly, my heels clicking against the hardwood like a drum roll, each step echoing through the vaulted room. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, my voice cool and unwavering. "Isabella Clark, representing Sinclair Holdings." The reaction was instantaneous. Victoria turned first, her face draining of color, her lips parting in a silent gasp. Edward's eyes widened, his hands gripping the table's edge. Nathan's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound sharp against the stunned silence. "Isabella," my mother whispered, her voice a threadbare plea. "What are you doing?" I placed my briefcase on the table and opened it with deliberate precision, the latch snapping open like a gunshot. "Your Honor," I said, pulling out a stack of documents. "Sinclair Holdings holds all outstanding debt of the Clark family, residential, personal, and corporate. This includes the mortgage on their primary residence, 3 lines of credit, and multiple business loans totaling approximately $12.7 million. I've been acquiring it systematically for 3 years through subsidiaries, Clark Properties, Sinclair Capital, Horizon 8, all under my control." "That's impossible," Nathan burst out, leaping to his feet, his face red with fury. "She works in a goddamn bookstore." A low murmur rippled through the room, the spectators leaning forward, their eyes glinting with hunger for the drama unfolding. I smiled faintly, a predator's calm. "Actually," I said, meeting his glare, "I own the bookstore, along with the building it's in, and most of the blocks surrounding it, 2 cafes, a law firm, a penthouse leased for 6 figures a year. And that's just the start." I turned to my mother, her mascara beginning to run. "I'm also the CEO of Sinclair Holdings," I said. "Formerly Margaret Sinclair Enterprises. Perhaps you've heard of it." The courtroom erupted in whispers, a wave of sound crashing against the walls. Even Judge Morgan looked up sharply, her gavel poised. "Order," she said firmly, banging it once, the crack silencing the room. "Miss Clark, continue." "3 years ago," I said, my voice steady as I paced before the bench, "I inherited my grandmother's entire estate, over $50 million in assets, liquid and otherwise. Since then, I've watched as my family," I paused, letting the word hang like a guillotine blade, "continued to refinance their home, max out their credit, and funnel every available dime into my brother's luxury lifestyle and failed ventures. 3 startups. All bust. A Porsche last year. A Maserati yesterday. All while they mocked me for scraping by." I turned to Nathan, my eyes locking onto his. "But here's the real twist. You had help, didn't you? Someone feeding you crumbs, trying to outmaneuver me?" His face went slack, his bravado crumbling. "What the hell are you talking about?" "Carter," I said, my voice rising slightly, cutting through his denial. "An IT specialist in my employ. He's been leaking intel to you for months. Details of my debt purchases, vague warnings about a big move. Thought he could profit when you flipped the script. He's in custody now, by the way. Security nabbed him this morning." The room buzzed again, louder this time, a hive of shock and intrigue. Nathan stammered, "I don't know what she's." "Save it," I cut in, holding up the printout Emily had pulled. "Your emails are with building security. Timestamped 2:14 a.m. She's got something massive on us. Push harder, I need leverage. You weren't just a fool, you were a hunter. You just picked the wrong prey." Edward stood, his face flushed with rage, his chair scraping back. "You can't do this to us, Isabella. We're your family." I turned to him fully, unflinching. "For 23 years, you made me feel like nothing," I said, my voice low and dangerous, each word a stone dropped into still water. "You mocked my job, ignored my education, student loans I paid off alone because you wouldn't co-sign, too busy funding Nathan's 3rd app flop. You poured everything into him and left me to fend for myself. And now, when you're drowning, you dare ask me for a lifeline from the daughter you dismissed?" Victoria's sobs broke the silence, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue, mascara streaming down her cheeks. "We didn't know," she choked out. "We never." "No," I interrupted, stepping closer, my shadow falling across her. "You never asked. You assumed. Because I wasn't flashing Rolexes or crashing sports cars, I didn't matter. You saw what you wanted to see, a failure. But I saw you, every lie, every weakness." Judge Morgan cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. "Miss Clark," she said, her tone measured, "do you intend to call in the dead in full?" "No, Your Honor," I replied, straightening, my hands clasped behind me. "I have a proposal." I laid out the terms with precision. Nathan's spending privileges revoked, effective immediately, no more cars, no more watches, no more blank checks. Mandatory financial counseling for all three of them, twice weekly, paid from their own accounts. The mansion sold at auction within 60 days, the proceeds split between debt repayment and a modest trust I'd already set up. A new home purchased under that trust, a 3-bedroom in Lincoln Park, bright and functional, no chandeliers or valets required. "You don't get to play royalty anymore," I finished, my voice ringing clear. "You live within your means, just like I did for years." The silence was suffocating, thick as the fog rolling off the lake in autumn. Victoria's sobs quieted to whimpers. Edward sank back into his chair, his shoulders slumping. Nathan stared at the floor, his phone forgotten. "We accept," Edward muttered finally, his voice a defeated rasp, barely audible over the hum of the courtroom. "We don't have a choice." "No," I said, gathering my briefcase with a soft click. "You never did." As I turned to leave, Nathan's voice stopped me, raw and ragged. "Why, Isabella? Why didn't you help us earlier?" I paused in the aisle, looked over my shoulder, and said calmly, "Because you never saw me. Not until I forced you to look." The doors swung shut behind me, the sound echoing like a final note, and I stepped into the hallway, the weight lifting from my shoulders with every step. The quiet rebuild. 3 months later, I sat in my office, the late February sun casting long shadows across the glass desk, the city sprawling below like a puzzle I'd pieced together in silence. The dust had settled, literally and figuratively. The Clark name no longer graced country club donor plaques or whispered through the halls of the Union League. My parents had sold the mansion at auction, the gavel falling on a $2.1 million bid that barely dented their debt. They'd moved into the Lincoln Park home I'd bought, a modest 3-bedroom with hardwood floors and a small backyard, no marble countertops or heated driveways in sight. Victoria had discovered budgeting apps on her phone, her fingers hesitant but learning, and clearance racks at Nordstrom Rack, where she now shopped without a personal stylist. Edward had taken up part-time consulting, mostly for pride, not profit, grumbling about downsizing but showing up to client meetings in a suit he hadn't replaced in a decade. Nathan was the real shock. He'd kept the job I'd secured for him, an entry-level gig at a logistics firm downtown, the kind of place where you clock in at 8 a.m. and leave when the work's done, not when your buzz wears off. He rode the L train every morning, packed in with commuters, his off-the-rack suits wrinkled but serviceable. No Maserati, no Porsche, just a CTA pass and a pair of scuff loafers. He hadn't drowned yet, and that alone surprised me more than I'd admit. They hadn't thanked me. Not really, not in words. Victoria sent a stiff "we're managing" text 2 weeks after the move. Edward nodded curtly when we passed on Michigan Avenue last month. But they hadn't broken the terms either. No extravagant purchases, no desperate calls for cash. That silence said more than any gratitude ever could. Carter was gone, fired, facing charges for fraud and theft, his plea deals still pending with the DA. Emily had uncovered his full scheme. He'd planned to sell Sinclair's secrets to Nathan for a 6-figure payout, then vanished to some non-extradition island when the dust settled. He'd misjudged me, thought I was too distracted to notice the crumbs he left behind. Loyalty, it turned out, was rarer than gold in this city, and I'd learned that lesson the hard way. A small photo frame sat on my desk, its edges faded but warm with memory, me at 9, sitting on a bench outside the bookstore with Margaret, both of us cradling cups of cocoa, steam curling into the crisp fall air, as we laughed like the world was ours alone. Her gray hair was pulled back in a loose bun, her eyes sharp and alive, and I could still hear her voice. "They'll underestimate you, Isabella.
Let them.
It's your weapon." She'd given me the tools, her empire, her wisdom, and I'd built the tower, brick by quiet brick, until it stood taller than theirs ever could. My phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Victoria. "Dinner this Friday? Just the four of us. Casual. No expectations. No talk of money. We'd like to try." I stared at it for a long time, the skyline glowing beyond my window, the John Hancock piercing the dusk, the Willis Tower a dark sentinel against the horizon. It wasn't a plea or a performance, not this time. They weren't asking me to play a role, to prop up Nathan's ego or polish their image. They weren't desperate, not anymore. They were maybe beginning to see me, or at least the shadow of who I'd become. I didn't know if I'd go. Part of me wanted to. Curiosity, maybe, or the faint echo of a girl who'd once craved their approval. Part of me didn't, the scars too deep, the fire still smoldering. I tapped out a reply, "Maybe. I'll let you know," and hit send, the choice mine alone. And that freedom, that power to decide, was everything I'd fought for. As I gathered my things, I passed the bookstore lobby downstairs, where a display of Margaret's favorite novels stood, Little Women, Jane Eyre, The House of Mirth, curated in her honor, their spines worn but proud. A girl, no older than 10, stood there with her mother, pointing at a framed photo of Margaret above the shelf. "She was a real person?" the girl asked, her voice bright with wonder. "Yes," her mother said, adjusting her scarf against the February chill leaking through the door. "And her granddaughter runs this company now. She's incredible." I smiled as I stepped into the night, the wind sharp against my skin, tugging at my coat. "Hey," I called to a passing staffer, a young guy with a clipboard and a hurried stride. "Tell the team we're launching a channel, Sinclair Stories. Real talk about power, grit, survival. Get people to subscribe. I want the world to hear this." He nodded, scribbling a note, and I walked on, the city's pulse thrumming beneath my feet. Power wasn't about screaming, it was about choosing when to speak and knowing they'd have no choice but to listen. Full circle. I pulled up to the Sinclair Legacy Foundation charity gala in a sleek black Mercedes, one of the few luxuries I'd allowed myself to flaunt in public, its engine purring as I handed the keys to the valet outside the Art Institute. The night was clear, the stars faint against the city's glow, the wind off the lake carrying a bite that matched the occasion. It was the first event of its kind, a tribute to Margaret's quiet philanthropy, decades of grants and scholarships funded from the shadows, stepping into the light for the first time. I stepped out, my custom gown, simple, elegant, a deep charcoal that caught the light without begging for it, hugging my frame as camera flashes erupted like a storm. Last year, I'd been invisible, a nobody in a bookstore apron and scuffed flats. Now they couldn't stop saying my name. Isabella Clarke, Sinclair heiress, Chicago's new titan, their lenses tracking me like hounds on a scent. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and champagne, half of Chicago's elite buzzing about the event, the other half scrambling to figure out how they'd missed my rise. Let them wonder. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd, their laughter and clinking glasses a familiar soundtrack I'd once envied, now commanded. I caught a glimpse of Victoria near the bar, her black dress tasteful and restrained, no sequins, no ostentation, her posture softer than I remembered. She looked at me across the room, her eyes holding something I'd never seen before, respect, or at least the beginnings of it. Nathan stood beside her, his suit off the rack but pressed, his hands empty, no champagne, no phone, just a quiet stillness I hadn't thought him capable of. They hadn't earned redemption, not yet, but they were trying, and that shift felt like a crack in a wall I'd long stopped trying to breach. I took the stage as the crowd hushed, their faces turning up to me like flowers to the sun. The microphone gleamed under the lights, and I leaned into it, my voice clear and steady. "Good evening," I began, the words ringing through the hall. "Tonight, We celebrate not just legacy, but transformation. My grandmother, Margaret Sinclair, believed true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in dignity, in perseverance, in knowing your worth even when no one else sees it. I paused, letting the silence settle, the weight of their attention pressing against me. She also taught me something else. I continued, my gaze sweeping the room. People show their truest selves when they think you have nothing. And sometimes, when you've seen the worst of someone, you finally get to choose whether they're worth your best. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a soft wave of recognition. I spotted Christopher Langford near the back, shifting uncomfortably in a rented tux, his family's company now a subsidiary of Sinclair Holdings after I'd called in their debt last month.
Good.
Let him squirm. Tonight, I said, lifting my chin, we announced the Sinclair Initiative for Financial Literacy, designed to help young women reclaim power over their futures. Because no daughter should ever be told she's worth less than her brother. No woman should have to build an empire just to prove she belongs. I paused again, then added, and if you want the unfiltered story, how it happened, what it cost, subscribe to Sinclair Stories. It's launching next month, a channel about power, grit, and the fights you don't see. Join us. Thunderous applause erupted, the sound crashing over me like a wave breaking on the shore. My heart pounded, not from nerves but from the sheer force of standing there, seen at last. I stepped off the stage, the crowd parting as I moved through them, no longer a shadow, but a force they couldn't ignore. Victoria approached me as the guests mingled, her steps tentative, her hands clasped in front of her. You looked powerful up there, she said, her voice soft, almost reverent. I replied, meeting her eyes without flinching. A beat passed, her lips trembling slightly. I never thought I'd say this, she whispered. But you were right. About everything. I held her gaze unyielding. No, Mother, I said. I always was. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the marble, toward the future I'd forged with my own hands, not out of spite, but strength. Just before I reached the exit, I paused and glanced back, raising my voice just enough for her to hear. Oh, and that blue dress you begged me to wear to Nathan's party. She turned, startled, her eyes wide. I bought the company, I said, a faint smile tugging at my lips. That style's discontinued. Her jaw dropped, a perfect tableau of shock and realization, and I stepped into the Chicago night, the wind catching my laughter and carrying it over the lake, where it mingled with the city's restless song.